Hello, I'm Richard Murphy, and we're talking about capitalism today. We've got John Christensen back with us. John is an economist who I've known for nearly a quarter of a century. We worked together to found the Tax Justice Network. John was previously to that the senior economics advisor to the states of Jersey, amongst other roles. And as a consequence, he knows a great deal about how capitalism does and does not work. And his multiple degrees in economics most certainly help him talk about that. Welcome back, John.
Greetings, Richard. Good to be back.
And this morning, I think you've nominated the subject for discussion, Homo Economicus, in the context of the work of Thorstein Veblen, a Norwegian working in America over a century ago, who talked about this concept of Homo Economicus and also the ravages, the savages of the economic world. John, introduce us to these two types of beast and why they are relevant to our thinking today.
Well, if you dig deep down into the neoclassical economics, go back to the 19th century, the late 19th century, a century which, of course, had seen economics evolve from moral philosophy, the world of Adam Smith and Ricardo, through Karl Marx and Karl Marx's view of a kind of deterministic history of economics shaping the world in kind of huge tectonic plates. In the late 19th century, a very different school of thinking emerged, and that school of thinking shaped neoclassical economics and shaped the economics that you and I learned in our undergraduate and possibly A-level world, the very mathematically driven world of the perfect competition model. Now, I am going to first of all talk about someone who I bet no one has ever heard of, or very few people have ever heard of, a professor of mathematics and economics at Oxford University, called Professor Francis Isidro Edgeworth. Now, Edgeworth...
Now, you got me there. Come on.
Okay, fascinating character. I suppose these days we'd regard him as a geek, a mathematician, a total geek, apparently very asocial. He was something of a disciple of Jeremy Bentham, and everyone's heard Bentham's conceptually. Bentham, who went on to found University College London, he conceived of human beings as rational pursuers of utility.
Yeah.
Even to the extent of them being human calculating machines. And as we walk and talk through our daily routines, we're constantly engaged in this kind of cost-benefit analysis, aiming to maximize the pleasure we derive from our incomes and our leisure time.
John, can I jump in there? Jump in for a moment. As far as we know, Jeremy Bentham created the word maximize. It wasn't known before he used it. This concept was new. So it's quite interesting that you use it straight away in the context of Bentham, because apparently he created the term. We weren't maximizers before Jeremy Bentham came up with the idea that we went around maximizing our utility, whatever our utility might be, which I'm sure is something you're going to move on to.
Absolutely. Well, live and learn. That's one of the things I love about our discussions. I'm constantly learning new things. So back to Francis Edgeworth, because he took Bentham thinking to create a model world of extreme tidiness, extreme precision, an exacting world in which we, that is you, me, and everybody listening to this, we're all constantly engaged in rationally calculating how best to achieve our personal pleasure domes of Xanadu. In other words, what we want most from life is a kind of hedonistic world in which we're constantly pursuing pleasure. Now, I see Edgeworth as very much a kind of product of what had happened in the world of natural physics and biology, the natural world, where the natural sciences was at that time adapting to Charles Darwin's thinking. But what Edgeworth was doing was he was trying to create a model of enlightened self-interest. We're going to keep on coming back to those words, enlightened self-interest. In Edgeworth's world, enlightened self-interest trumps all other human motivations. And fair enough, so it trumps love and caring for one another and perhaps hate and, not caring for one another. Enlightened self-interest rules the world. There's no consideration in this model of the possibility that some people have accumulated wealth and power, which enables them to shape markets for their own gain, and who can use their power over other people to exploit those people, to exploit their labor, even to the extent of enslaving them. In other words, this was a lightly closed circuit world in which everyone operated without any consideration of power relations or whatever. Again, Richard, I know that this departs a long way from your vision of how the world really works.
Indeed. I mean, I think there was actually somebody before Edgeworth who came up with this idea, first of all. As far as I can see from my reading, the first person who came up with something that looks like this rational human being was somebody called, I'm checking my notes here, because this isn't somebody I'm terribly familiar with, Adolphe Quetelet, a Frenchman who in 1831 defined the average economic person.
Right.
There we get this idea so early, even in the classical era, that we can't deal with somebody who's...
There was a German who called Johann von Thunen.
Yes, I've heard of him.
I studied quite a bit because he's often regarded as the kind of founding father or founding parent of agricultural economics. Was his focus was on agricultural rents, and he was also looking at this kind of very rational human being.
It's extraordinary, isn't it, that economics so early on was departing from theories of moral philosophy, which must therefore include ideas of divergence and what we would now call abnormality with regard to behavior, and was instead trying to create this idea of the normal, the incredibly dangerous idea that we're all normal, which I have to say, John, I've never thought of you as being. I'm sorry to tell you that.
God, stuff you, I'm out of here. But look, if you read Adam Smith and other classical economists, Adam Smith's world was a world of businessmen continually colluding against the public interest, of journeymen who were in one way or another sabotaging situations or trying to get market advantage, of a world of real human beings. But somehow, during the course of the 19th century, that world disappeared. And when Edgeworth published his book, the book he's most famous for, he's obviously not very famous these days, but in 1881, which is just less than a decade after the most catastrophic banking crisis, which in my opinion precipitated by, amongst other things, the end of the slave economy in North America, he published a book called, and it's a very unusual title, Mathematical Psychics.
Yeah,
No,
obviously.
Right. But as I said, he was something of a geek, and he was looking for a very tidy explanation of human behavior. And in Mathematical Psychics, he set out to demonstrate that in a world of perfect competition, and I think we need to get back to that world of perfect competition in another podcast, which is inhabited by perfectly rational human calculation machines, getting back to Bentham, each and every one of those humans pursuing their self-interest, the outcome of that process of us all individually pursuing self-interest in an enlightened, rational sort of way would be the highest possible amount of utility and pleasure that society could achieve. The best of all possible worlds. And this human calculating machine, here Homo economicus, lies at the heart of the model most people, most economists use.
Yes.
And most of the mathematical models used these days are based upon this heaven on earth.
Heaven on earth. What a
Yeah.
fisco paradis, or something very close to it. Yeah, this is one of those absurd ideas that there is an optimal outcome. And the point here, by the way, is not that everybody has an optimal outcome, because that's clearly not what was being suggested by the early neoclassicists. What they were saying was that they could define a world where any change would leave somebody worse off. And that was what worried them. So we're not talking about creating a perfect world. We're creating a world where somebody would be worse off if something was supposedly changed. But they didn't worry about distribution in that, did they?
Not at all. And of course, yes, Pareto went on, and Pareto efficiency was very much based, the idea of Pareto's efficiency was very much based upon the ideas of adopting policies which leave people better off without making people worse off. And I think that line of thinking, of course, was what led much earlier on in the 19th century to this idea that, hell, we're not going to compensate the slaves who will be no worse off from disenslavement. We'll compensate the slave owners who will be very much worse off as a result of losing their slaves. So that kind of thinking, in my mind, it was brutish and it's shocking, because
For those not familiar with that idea, the UK government gave the slave owners over £20 million, as I understand it. Now, let's
a
put
lot
that
of money in the 1830s.
And that money effectively went on to provide the capital for railways. They reinvested their ill-gotten gains from basically selling their slaves into freedom, compensated by the British government, to reinvest in railways. It was a social side effect which nobody could have anticipated. But actually, it also means that, in effect, all the railways were created with state money in the UK. But that's a neat little sideline. It just took until 1947 for them to come into state ownership. But this idea that you put forward there, that we don't worry about the slaves because they're no worse off, exactly consistent with this line of thinking. And it's really not rational or human at all, in my opinion. But anyway, I'm diverting you from your theme, John.
It was shocking. And of course, the railway economy went on to shape a world which we're going to discuss in a few minutes when we start talking about Veblen's worldview. Let's get back to Francis Edgeworth, because his pursuit of mathematical purity and exactness reshaped classical economics. The old world of moral philosophers, I think, was replaced in the 1880s by this new cohort of economic professors, men like Alfred Marshall at Cambridge and Stanley Jevons at Manchester, and others, of course, who looked at the world from their new faculties of economics and saw a largely benign marketplace inhabited by peaceful and enlightened pleasure maximizers, Homo economicus, out there on the streets.
And they called themselves liberals.
Liberals, oh, you're very much liberal thinking. And of course, the Evans up in Manchester was very much at the heart of emerging liberal thinking.
Yes.
But now I want to take us to the other side of the Atlantic, and another economist, also, Richard, interesting, something of an anthropologist, which I think interests you.
It does, because I think social anthropology is fundamental to the understanding of economics, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, no, I think we're agreed on that. Shocking agreement on this one. But this economist grew up in a very tightly knit, closed society, a community of Norwegians who'd settled in Minnesota. And he was looking at the world through a completely different lens and came to radically different conclusions about human behavior and motivations. So let's shift attention away from Francis Edgeworth and introduce one of my favorite economists, thinkers, social anthropologists, to use your term, Richard, Thorstein Veblen. Now, many people have heard of Veblen, uh, let alone Veblen goods, which are named after him. But Thorstein Veblen is most famous for this idea of conspicuous consumption.
Yep.
We'll get back to that idea in a few minutes' time. But Veblen poured scorn over the very idea, the very notion that modern man operates as a pursuer of enlightened self-interest, elegantly pursuing the noble science of maximizing personal pleasure. He said, guys, you need to get out there on the streets and see what's really happening. Because Veblen was growing up in the late 19th century, and this was a period of robber barons.
Yep.
Robber barons engaged in deliberately sabotaging their rivals, even to the extent that they were blowing up their rivals' plant, their trains, their machinery, and their entire distribution networks. They were killing people. They were using dynamite. And these nice, tidy, exacting economists sitting in their university faculties were talking about the exercise of competition within the marketplace to describe these activities. Veblen was looking at bankers and brokers who were rigging the markets to cheat their clients. He saw monopolists right the way across the scene who were price gouging their customers, cheating their creditors, and even forcing their suppliers into penury. And of course, he was sitting in the world post the Civil War in the United States, the emerging world of Jim Crow, in which black people were still discriminated against and were being pauperized by low wages and high prices and discrimination. So Thorstein Veblen had no time at all for the neat, fanciful notions of Homo Economicus, the walking, talking cost-benefit calculator. What he wanted to do, what he set out to do with a kind of ruthless determination, was to understand the true nature of economic man. And he was asking questions like, what really motivates the players in the field? Who are the leisure class who accumulate wealth and power to extract wealth from the working classes? And why do some societies accept, of course, when I think some societies, he's looking particularly at the US, but I think the same applied to Imperial Britain and all the European imperial powers. Why do some societies like that accept greed and predatory behavior and elevate the most brutal and destructive sociopaths to the highest level?
You shock me, John. You shock me. I've never noticed this. Tell me more.
Indeed. And before everyone thinks, well, this is just some kind of economic historian ruminating about the good old days of the 19th century, I think 21st century Trumpville shows exactly the same characteristics.
Yes, it does indeed.
And that's something we can discuss. Now, I think that questions about the kind of questions Thorstein Veblen was raising would simply flummox the average neoclassical, mathematically driven economist. But Veblen was a rather extraordinary person. He was never he was never an insider. He was something of an outsider. He was looking at this world sort of the perspective of someone who, although he was born and grew up in Minnesota, Norwegian was his first language, English was his second language. He was something of a misfit. But he was extraordinarily popular. I mean, students loved him. They hated his lectures because he mumbled and murmured right the way through them. And believe it or not, Richard, I mean, he's the exact opposite of you. He was especially popular with women. That's not the exact opposite of you, but that's it. But just one little kind of anecdote to illustrate the nature of Veblen. He was called in by the dean of the faculty, who said, Veblen, I'm worried about your relations with the faculty wives. Of course, there were no women in the faculty at the time, but I'm worried about your relationship with the faculty wives. And Veblen said, yeah, I find it impossible to keep them out of my bedroom. That's what humanity was.
Yes.
Now, unlike many other economists at that time and now, he actually went out of his way to observe and to understand how humans interact in different cultures. And he visited other countries, including Pacific Islands and so on. And he observed how some cultures encourage cooperative behavior, whilst others, hiding behind the rubric of laissez-faire, free market economics, anything goes, these cultures allow predators and brutes to let rip.
I think it's really interesting you make that point about observing, because that rings echoes in my ears of Danny Blanchflower, who has this concept, David Blanchflower, who was, of course, at one point on the Bank of England Monetary Policy Committee and was very definitely an outsider there. And why was he an outsider? Because he did what Veblen did. He went out and looked at the real world. He calls it the economics of walking about, which is, of course, social anthropology. Actually go and see what people are doing and then try and explain that, rather than to create some neat theory which looks incredibly good on your blackboard, as would have been the case at the time, your whiteboard or your computer screen or whatever else now. But the point was, that's what most economists have ever done. And I guess that distinction is absolutely vital, and it's almost the one that still exists. There are the 90+% of economists who will live in their little mathematical world where Homo economicus is really important. I mean, this rational human agent, and they will now call them the human agent rather than perhaps Homo economicus, because they've got rather embarrassed by that term and have done for maybe a century now. But they will still use it. And in fact, if you look at what is called dynamic stochastic general equilibrium modeling, DSGE modeling, which is used by the Office for Budget Responsibility and the Bank of England, there is a single human agent in there. Now, that is that average human being who I referred to, named by that French guy in 1831, the single entity, this rational human being. They actually removed the human element of our humanity from us when modeling the behavior of the economy, and therefore come up with perfect answers. By the way, if you ever wondered why every single model of the economy apparently works out okay, according to the Office for Budget Responsibility in the Bank of England, it's because they also presume that because we know everything, which is what Homo economicus does, we always put things right within 2 years. So
Yes.
every single model they create goes right. All they deal with is the aberrations that they think exist. We would never create those aberrations, by the way, because why would we create an aberration? We're rational utility maximizers. But these aberrations are created by external shocks. But thankfully, because we're rational utility maximizers, we can always put it right. Now, I make this point now to actually contrast it with everything you've been saying, John, because it will be so easy to think, yeah, but this was the 19th century. You've already alluded to the fact it isn't. But actually, this idea still dominates modern macroeconomic thinking, and it's profoundly dangerous.
Absolutely. And it's one of the reasons why when I went to university, I decided not to go to a faculty of pure economics. I went to a faculty of applied economics, agricultural, precisely because there, I think they are more rooted in the way the world actually works, particularly on trade theory. But I want to get back to Edgeworth because, or rather Veblen's view on Edgeworth, because whilst Edgeworth saw a very civilized world of rational, tidy Homo economicus, Veblen, who, by the way, was based at the University of Chicago at that stage, saw a much more savage world in which wealthy and powerful people shaped the markets to their own interests, leaving millions of people pauperized and even destitute. And of course, Homo economicus never even considered the distributional issues, never considered inequality. It just simply wasn't an issue at that time. And if you want to have a look at how the predators, the brutes, were out there letting rip, I want to give a fascinating example of a shipping magnate of that time, Cornelius Vanderbilt, quite a famous man. Yeah, exactly. Who realized that his rivals were kind of ganging up against them So he sent a letter, and I'm going to quote from that letter. Well, I'll quote the entire letter. "Gentlemen, you have undertaken to ruin me. I will not sue you, because the law takes too long. I will ruin you. Sincerely, etc., Vanderbilt." And he proceeded to do just that in the most ruthless fashion. That was the real world in which the magnates were operating, the rubber barons. And another example, we've all heard of the banker J.P. Morgan,
Yes.
and this provides a fascinating insight into political economy, and the way in which the really wealthy and the powerful they operate in total impunity, because that wealth provides these people with the ability to operate outside the law and the social norms that most normal people abide by. Morgan was hell-bent on doing something which was of questionable legality, and his legal advisors and colleagues were warning him against going ahead with this. But he completely wiped them, and he actually shouted at a board meeting, "I don't want my lawyers to tell me what I cannot do. I hire lawyers to tell me how I can do what I want to do," which is
Yes.
slightly more refined than blowing up your rival operators with dynamite, but only slightly. What he was saying is, the law c'est moi. I shape the law to my own interests.
Mhm.
And which is worth saying, okay, that was late 19th century, early 20th century, but look west to the United States now, where the current president operates completely outside the law with impunity. He flogs his dodgy meme coins to the gullible people out there, and he stops at nothing to use his executive powers to silence critics and rivals.
Absolutely, John. Can I just pick up I want to pick up a point here, because your flow is fascinating, but there's something again which is, I think, worth highlighting, if I might. You introduced into that last point the term political economy, and I think it's really worth highlighting the difference between political economy and economics, because really that's, in a very real sense, what we're talking about here. Economics is this supposedly neutral, actually deeply biased study of a supposed society which does not exist, using mathematical models which do not relate to reality to come up with answers which are of no relevance to anyone. I generalize slightly, but that's my view of what economics broadly does.
Harsh, but I
Political,
recognize it.
okay, harsh, I accept, but nonetheless, let's live with it for the moment. Political economy, and I think of myself as a political economist. Indeed, I was a professor of political economy for 5 years. Is a subject which looks at how power relationships alter the allocation of resources within society, and therefore comes up with a very different model, because it accepts that there are, if you like, attractors within this model, the powerful, who can do things with economic resources which other people simply can't. And that totally distorts the modeling. There is an assumption inside the economist modeling that everybody is equal, in effect, which is completely absurd. Homo economicus is a representative person, but actually everybody is Homo economicus. Therefore, we are supposedly all equal. But clearly, that's so absurd an idea
Exactly.
that it is just invalidates everything that the vast majority of what economics has to say. And political economy, what Veblen was doing by walking around in the real world, was saying, hang on, guys, we have to examine power. And if we don't examine power and its abuses, we can't come up with a model of the world we live in. And I think that's really what he was doing. And he was very early in doing so.
Extraordinary. Look, in the early 20th century, right at the start of the century, he published a book, an extraordinary book in which he explored the motivations and the behavior of rich and powerful people.
Mm.
That book is The Theory of the Leisure Class. And it was a bestseller. It was a bestseller in North America. It was a bestseller in Europe, around the world, which is slightly extraordinary because Veblen wrote in a rather detached and very clinical language. It's, you've got to read his sentences and interpret them and mull on them. And after 50 years of reading them, I'm still kind of lost in his language. But he expounded this theory that the members of the wealthy and powerful upper classes were they remain as brutal and as predatory in their nature as earlier societies. They still
Yes.
engage in plunder. They still loot.
Yes.
They threaten brute force and physical strength. Clearly, blowing up your rival train operators is one of. They use cunning. They use guile to get their way. They flog meme coins to any old idiot out there on the streets. And they surround themselves with paid retainers, not carrying cudgels and swords, but these people are lawyers, bankers, and politicians who did their will. And yet they disguised their activities behind this veneer of civility and sophistication, eating of silver plates and so on, and used conspicuous consumption, that phrase again, that term which Veblen kind of deployed, as a way of demonstrating their wealth and their power, and to set themselves apart from the rest of us. So whilst Edgeworth was looking at this benign world of equal human beings, Veblen saw a world inhabited by primates and suits who deployed private jets and super yachts to demonstrate that they are the alpha members of the pack.
Hence conspicuous consumption.
Hence conspicuous consumption. So if you
The
take a look
indication
at
the indication of power, consumption to indicate power.
yes,
effectively.
exactly,
Yes.
and indifference to the rest, setting themselves completely apart. And the extraordinary thing about this, and this is where kind of Marx would have teared his hair out, because he expected that eventually the pauperized and impoverished proletariat would rise up. What Veblen observed was that the working masses actually wanted to emulate those people. They want the private jets, the multiple homes, they want the flashy cars, all the rest of it. And Veblen observed that this was actually a way of keeping the population quiet, keeping the pitchforks off the streets. Now, I kind of want to fast forward to the 21st century.
But hang on, in a sense, he was dismissing the American dream then. He was saying the American dream was, in that sense, a fabrication of control.
I think he was, but he was saying it was a dream which everyone bought into, because what they really, really, really wanted was the same private jets and the same super yachts, and the rest of it, the multiple homes, and the lifestyles of the super rich. And so if we get back to come forward from Veblen's book, The Theory of the Leisure Class, to the 21st century, and zoom in again on Donald Trump and that coterie of billionaires who lined up, the tech bros who lined up behind him, swearing in ceremony in January. I'm thinking here about Musk and Zuckerberg and Jeff Bezos. I think that we can all acknowledge that Veblen was much closer to the truth about human behavior than Edgeworth and his fellow mathematicians of the Martin School. I just want to say that because that's clearly where I line up. I think that Veblen's insights were much more, much closer to reality than anything the marginalists ever came up with. But Richard, Veblen followed up the theory of the leisure class with another book. This one's called The Theory of the Business Class. And whilst the theory of the leisure class sold like hotcakes and everyone wanted to go out and listen to Veblen, the business class book stirred up a hornet's nest, because in the business class, he argued that in many sectors of the economy, business people intermediate between producers and consumers, not because they can improve on productivity or they can enhance price competitiveness or the quality of services provided, but because they could place themselves in situations on the supply chain where they could disrupt the supply chain and extract rents and wealth from the supply chain. And to do this, these business people, who of course we elevate as very important entrepreneurs, and we call them all sorts of things, but to do this, they restrict the supply. And look at the energy sector, for example. Or they sabotage companies by overloading them with debt. Think about the water companies in Britain. the business class thrive by exerting market power, typically through monopoly positions, and they use their accumulated wealth and power to not just they use their accumulated wealth and power to not just influence, but to directly control politicians and shape the political economy in their favor.
I agree with you entirely. And in fact, the model that came to my mind, and yours are entirely valid and appropriate, but the model that came to my mind immediately was, in fact, the supermarkets.
Yes.
Because they control food supply. They are monopolist buyers from agricultural suppliers. They control the prices that farmers get. They keep them in relative poverty and in need of government subsidy. They employ staff who can only work there because they receive government subsidy in a great many cases in the form of benefits, universal credit, and so on to support their lifestyles because they're not paid enough. And they extract from that process a monopoly profit, in effect, by requiring that we buy from a limited range of outputs. And we look at somebody like Tesco, and they've got a quarter of the UK market or whatever else. But as a consequence, they also do something which is incredibly dangerous, and that is they do limit supply. So, for example, we have a health crisis in the UK. And now I happen to know one thing that we both share in common, John, is that we can cook and we enjoy cooking and we like home cooked food and we've enjoyed each other's food on occasions. But the point is that they actually are trying to sell us an ultra processed diet where cooking has become alien to the human nature. And this is in itself also dangerous because when they can eliminate the ability to cook from the human being, and they have in a great many cases, and this isn't just because of poverty and it isn't just because of a lack of resources, although I recognize those issues, don't get me wrong, anybody who's listening. They've also actually tried to take away the skill because that increases their power. And they're doing this to extract money from us because it costs more, in fact, to buy, in most cases, an ultra-processed meal. And quite often, it takes longer to prepare that ultra-processed meal, even if it's only in heating it up in the oven or microwave, than it would do to cook something much more nutritious from scratch. So this conspiracy, again, which he identified over a century ago, is still going on. And it's a reality in our lives now.
And you're saying this today, Richard, on a day when UNICEF announced that there are now more young people, children, suffering from obesity and overweightness than there are young people suffering from undernourishment. So it's malnourishment now rather than undernourishment.
Yes.
And that, I think, is a consequence of this. But I want to wrap up, if I may, because reaching out of time. I want to wrap up by talking, just overviewing my understanding of Veblen. I think here's a man, an economist, who went out of the faculty to actually look at capitalism in practice. And what he saw was a political economy shaped by vested interests, a term he used all the time, or very frequently. I think he used it all the time. And these vested interests could brazenly use their ownership and control of, amongst other things, the media, to pursue their interests at the expense of others. He saw monopolists blocking any attempt at competition through hostile takeovers and mergers. Think about Peter Thiel. He saw business developing intellectual property rights as a mechanism for reinforcing their monopoly positions and extracting monopolist rents through price gouging. We can mention any of the tech bros to achieve that. And worse, in the emerging democracy of the 20th century, he saw weak politicians who were in the pockets of those vested interests. And we don't need to mention any names apart from Keir Starmer, who comes to mind at this stage, who cravenly kowtow to wealthy and powerful players and hand them the tax breaks and the regulatory cuts that they're aimlessly demanding from the state in the name of competitiveness. So what a different world from Homo Economicus and the quiet world of Francis Edgeworth.
But as I previously mentioned, our economists working for our government are working in the world of Edgeworth and not in the world of Veblen. And they pretend that Edgeworth rules and that we are all rational human beings and agents in the way that they describe, and not people who are the victims of abuse as Veblen described. Is that a fair summary, John?
Yes, fair enough. So sadly, the mathematical geeks won out. That is tragic, I think, because, real people are so much better in, than the Homo Economicus and this kind of rigorous, self-interested calculating machine. Real people do actually love and care and cherish and do all sorts of wonderful things. And all of that's missing from economics.
At that point, I don't think there's anything else to say. I think you've rounded up our conversation. Thank you so much, John. We are going to talk again soon because I've thoroughly enjoyed this. You're going to be a regular guest, I have this feeling, and I don't think anyone's going to complain. So thank you and see you soon.